Can I just ask someone to let me know that you can see the PowerPoint slides?
We can see it.
You can. Okay. Sorry, just bear with me, please. I think I opened the wrong PowerPoint. So sorry. Give me a minute, guys. Sorry. You know, I'm one of those people who's technically challenged as well, so that doesn't help much. Okay, let me try again. Okay, right. Can you guys all see that? Sorry, asking you again just to confirm that you can all see that.
Not a problem. Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so guys, what is this thing called civil society? I've used that term a lot just in my introduction. Exactly what does it mean? I'm not really greatly fond of, you know, specifically defining things and especially defining civil society. But the reason that I start off with this slide of trying to define it is because one of the first times that I taught this session, I didn't define it. And at the end of the session, one of the students put up their hands and said to me, a student who'd said nothing throughout the 2.5 hour session, put up their hands and said to me, yes, but what is a definition of civil society? So now I just start with it so that we can start thinking about it as we move through the course, and why you will understand why I don't really want to define it. You'll understand that by the end of the session. Okay, so Adam Habib has defined civil society as the triangular space between the family, the state, and the market. So if you think of the 3 points of a triangle, and you think of the family at the top, the state at the second point, and the market at the third point, and you think of all the area in between, everything else that happens in between that as civil society. So a more classical definition of civil society is anything between the family, so the private sort of arena, and the state, the public arena. So anything that happens in between there is civil society. So the reason that I don't think it's useful to define it is because I think it's more useful to see it as a concept that has evolved over time. In some schools of thought, it's seen as a mediator, acting as a buffer between the individual and the state, or a buffer between the individual and forces of the market. So think about here the various campaigns against corruption, right? We've seen those in lots of countries. We've seen those in South Africa, the Save South Africa campaign, for example. People who think that the state has got it wrong, or there's corruption, or there's things that have to be stopped, alerted, held back, changed. You see it in campaigns against globalization, people protesting against the big corporates who control the world, right? They're doing that in the civil society space. So in other schools of thought, it's valued as cultivating citizenship, as well as generating and maintaining values in society. So think here about various societies and clubs that put forth certain ideologies, certain ways of conducting yourself that builds certain values, for example, builds a sort of moral consensus. Also faith-based organizations would fall in here. People conduct themselves in a certain way because they're bound by a certain value system, certain ideas of morals or ethics. So for me, I understand civil society as an arena, a public space, sometimes with blurred borders, where diverse values and interests interact. So civil society actors could include organizational forms, but also informal associations, movements, and also instances of collective action. Okay, so something like the public protest that we see in South Africa every day. For me, that's absolutely civil society. The reason I say that now is because a lot of my work is based on social protest, and I get that question a lot. Is that civil society? Yes, my opinion, it is. Okay, so in the readings that you were prescribed, there were two rather different definitions of civil society. So, you know, if you had read those two articles, and I chose them quite specifically, you would have seen two sort of very different ideas about civil society emerging. I think that you would have picked that up quite easily. In the first, civil society is seen as an important component of democracy. So that's in the more liberal tradition of why civil society is an integral part of democracy. But the second perspective, the more radical perspective, drawing from Marxist traditions and the work of Antonio Gramsci, civil society is a much more contested terrain, something that's quite distinctly problematized. Okay, so let's look more carefully at those two definitions. The liberal definition of civil society, I'm actually going to read this definition from your reading. So it is I think it's the first reading that you've got, the Larry Diamond reading. So if you are looking at it, you can look at it. Otherwise, just make a note. It's on page 221. And I'm actually going to read the definition to you. So bear with me. If you were in class, I would have made someone read it. So I'm doing the participatory classwork here today as well. Civil society is the realm of organized social life that is open. Okay, so it's an open space, voluntary, no one's forced to be in there, there's no coercion, self-generating, at least partially self-supporting, autonomous from the state. Okay, so that's important for the liberals. They're understanding civil society as being separate from the state. So there's autonomy in civil society for the liberals. And bound by a legal order or a set of shared values. It is distinct from quote unquote society in general in that it involves citizens acting collectively in a public sphere to express their interests, passions, preferences, and ideas, to exchange information, to achieve collective goals, to make demands on the state. That's an important one for a democracy, to improve the structure and functioning of the state, and also to hold state officials accountable. So this liberal definition of civil society draws from de Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville's ideas on civil society, where he argued that civil society is the arena where the art of association occurs. So the art, associational life, being able to associate, is an art. And this occurs through, well, associations, including literary and scientific societies, professional and commercial associations and bodies, organizations also for leisure and recreation. So civil society encompasses an array of organizations. They could be formal, they could be informal. There's a list of them in the reading on page 222. So maybe make a note of 222 and go and have a look. I'll quickly go through them. So you could have productive and commercial associations and networks. You could have cultural organizations such as religious, ethnic institutions. And these sort of cultural and religious ethnic organizations would defend collective rights, values, beliefs. You could have information and educational organizations. So these would be devoted to the production and dissemination of ideas, of knowledge, of news, of information. You could have interest groups. So these groups would seek to advance or defend the common functional or material interests of their members. An example would be a trade union. Excuse me, it's just, I don't generally talk so much. And so in these sessions, you'll find me coughing rather a lot. I'm not sick, don't worry, no COVID here. Interest groups, okay? Developmental organizations. So these would be organizations and networks that pool resources and talents to improve their communities, infrastructure perhaps, institutions, quality of life of a community. You could have issue-oriented movements. So here you would find movements who are advocating for environmental protection, land reform, consumer protection, racial justice, gender justice, ethnic justice, any victims of discrimination, of abuse. could have civic groups. So these groups seek to improve the political system and make it more democratic. So groups that, for example, work to advocate for human rights, that work towards voter education, mobilizing around elections, monitoring elections, groups that advocate for reforming corrupt practices, for example. We spoke of an example of that earlier. So it's in this dimension. So if you think about all these organizations all operating within a democracy, it's within this dimension that citizens are educated for politics. So the idea here is that you can't have a proper working democracy if citizens are not used to the idea of associational life and are educated in the ways of being active citizens. So when I did some work on protest in Cato Manor, and I was talking to the protesters, they kept using this term abahlali, and I kept thinking it was a reference to the shack dwellers movement, abahlali base Mjondolo. But actually what they meant by abahlali was that we are the citizens who protest, so we are the ones who are active. So you could just sit in your house and hope that things get better, or you could go out and insist on things getting better. Sometimes it may work, sometimes it may not, but there's the difference between that active and that passive citizen. So the idea, this idea that draws from de Tocqueville is that citizens here are educated for politics because they become active citizens. It's also in the civil society dimension where the potential excesses of the state are controlled. So these organizations also work sometimes quite directly as watchdog organizations over the state. You know, NGOs such as the former IDASA that actually used to vet white papers before the papers were passed into acts. You know, there was actual funding oriented around a program that would vet white papers in Parliament. So the civil society domain is also where ideas are renewed and understandings developed. So here you could think about issue-based campaigns that may say, well, this is wrong, and then they also have the space to say, well, do it like this. So we are not just criticizing you, we're saying, why don't you do it like this? There are other places that do it like this, or it's never been done like this before, but why can't it be done like this now? It's in those issue-based campaigns. You know, even organizations like trade unions would often come up with alternatives, doing things differently, doing things better, doing things in a way that maybe have worked somewhere else. Okay, so now let's move on to the other definition of civil society that emerged from your readings. Before I start talking about this, I just want you all to please take a deep breath and relax. People often panic when I start talking about Gramsci and when we start talking about Marxist understandings or sort of Marxist interpretations of things. Once you understand this, you are going to be so interested in civil society and how it works. And if you don't understand it now, it will become very, very clear as we move through the sessions and we look at quite specific examples of how this sort of critique is actually working in our environments. So this is something really very exciting. Don't panic, relax. So the more radical definition of civil society is drawing from Marxist understandings of the civil society sphere, okay, and drawing specifically from the works of Antonio Gramsci. I don't know if you have come across his work in your other sessions. You may well have. I hope you have. So the Marxists don't view civil society as distinct from the state, from the private or public sector. Okay, remember the definition that I just read to you, sort of the liberal understanding of civil society as being autonomous from the state? Well, the Marxists don't agree with that. For them, civil society is an integral part of the state. For them, the state is made up of political society plus civil society. So by political society here, I'm referring to all the state organs, okay? So the executive, the legislature, the police, the military. So for them, the state is made up of that plus civil society. So they are arguing that civil society is in fact the most resilient element of the state, even though the most visible aspect of the state is political society. So when we think about the state, we see political society very clearly, right? If you drive down the highway, I drove here on the M4 and you see eThekwini Metro Police and you realize you haven't got your seatbelt on and you quickly put it on. That's a very clear vision of the state, right? You're understanding the state, you see the organs of the state, you see the police, you pick up a newspaper, you read what decisions have been made around lockdown, for example. Those decisions are made at state level. But what you don't see is the way that civil society is working in the background, okay? So for the Marxists, for Antonio Gramsci, it is in political society that the state exercises coercion and domination by force, and in civil society, cultural ideological hegemony. So the state uses political society to exercise coercion. So we can see, for example, eThekwini police, and so that's a very visible form of coercion. I quickly put my seatbelt on. But in civil society, it exercises cultural ideological hegemony. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with this term hegemony, it's just a fancy word for power, for dominance, right? If there's a dominant ideology, that's the hegemony. So civil society is where the cultural ideological understandings are built that allows the state to exercise things in a certain way. So here I've used a number of examples to try to illustrate this point when I've taught this course over the years. Sure, and I've taught this course for a long time now. But there is one example that works particularly well. I don't know why, and I'm going to use that example. So it's a personal example. It's about me, right? So growing up, my mother always told me, and I was terrified of my mother. I mean, I had great respect for her, but I was also terrified of her. She's in her 80s now. I'm still terrified of her. I don't know if it's a good thing for a girl to be terrified of her mother, but I was very afraid of my mother. So my mother always told me that there are two kinds of women. There are ladies, and then there are cheap women. So it never occurred to me to wonder if there was anything in between. All I knew was that I absolutely did not want to be a cheap woman. So she had planted this idea in my head of the way a lady would behave as opposed to the way a cheap girl would behave, a cheap lady would behave. So she's already planted this in my head. She uses coercion, such as telling me I can't wear a short skirt, telling me I can't go to this party, taking away my credit card, so that obviously I can't do very much, and grounding me. Those are the forms of coercion she uses, but she's also planted an idea in my head as to what I shouldn't be. I shouldn't be cheap. I should be a lady. So I don't want to wear short skirts of my own accord, not because she's not allowing me to wear them. It's an idea. I've been conditioned now to a certain way of thinking. So in that similar way, it's with civil society that the state can condition citizens into a particular way of thinking that produces consent amongst these citizens. And then it can use coercion, using its police, using its military to make us follow the rules and regulations and the laws. Okay, so there's two things at play here for the Marxists. And you see that they are problematizing civil society. It's a much more contested terrain than the autonomous space that the liberals who are interested in how it's integral to building a good democracy understand it. Okay, so In the liberal tradition, civil society is an important component of democracy, and this is for three reasons. It pluralizes the institutional arena. So the idea is that more civic actors means more opportunities for a wider range of interest groups to have a voice. It performs a watchdog role over the state. So civil society organizations are well placed to provide oversight over the state, and also to form alliances to place pressure on the state. And as we do sessions on NGOs and social movements, we'll see exactly how this has worked in our own context. And civil society is also important as a service providing not-for-profit sector. So civil society is often seen in this residual way. So it's residual to the state. It just fills in the gaps that the state can't reach. And one of those is to provide services. In terms of the more radical perspectives, civil society is more complicated. And there is this famous quote from Antonio Gramsci, and I'm going to read it to you because it's one of my favorite quotes. So it's in the second reading. So I don't know which one came first. So it's in the Cox reading, and it's on page 7. And you might well have come across the quote before, and I'm just going to read just a small part of it. When the state trembled, a sturdy structure of civil society was at once revealed. The state was only an outer ditch, behind which there stood a powerful system of fortresses and earthworks. So if we draw from this quote, the understanding is that the state has an outer ditch, but it's backed up by a very powerful system, and that is that ability to produce consent amongst citizenry that allows the state to function the way that it functions. So that quote is on page 7, if you want to look at it. So the state exercises dominance through civil society. Civil society organizations and the norms they uphold promote and entrench dominant state ideologies. So this could be done in a number of ways, through what happens in associations and clubs, even through spatial developments in architecture and the layout of streets or the naming of streets. So a good example of this is all the statues that have been falling during the hashtag Black Lives Matter disruptions over the last few months, and questions that are being asked with those cultural spaces. Why do we have these statues of people who were slave owners, people who were openly racist, people who were openly oppressive to the nations that they colonized? And people have begun to ask those questions. I mean, people have been asking those questions for a long time, but it really seems to have hit the media and social media in particular over the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement activities over the last few months. So that's an example of how those sort of cultural elements are used to indoctrinate ideas amongst people and get people used to certain ideas. So I suppose I think I should give an example here of civil society organizations entrenching dominant state ideology. So examples would be, okay, this is often a bit of a contentious example, and this obviously we can discuss. Think of an NGO during Thabo Mbeki's administration. We did not have antiretrovirals available in the public healthcare sector, and we're going to be looking very carefully at the social movement, the Treatment Action Campaign that brought us antiretrovirals in the public healthcare sector. But if you think of some of the NGOs that were working, contracted with government on its prevention campaign. So the state's idea was to increase prevention because it wasn't providing ARVs. So if you were HIV positive and you were using the public healthcare sector, you couldn't access ARVs. Basically, HIV was a death sentence. The state was very much focused on prevention campaigns. So you would have NGOs that were working on these prevention campaigns, perhaps providing free contraceptive, etc. But then you had a social movement like the Treatment Action Campaign, who was going against the grain and saying, no, actually, we don't want to support your prevention campaign. Yes, we agree with prevention. It's definitely an important component of the struggle, but we don't agree with you not providing ARVs. You need to provide ARVs under the idea of health rights. Okay, South Africans have rights to access health, and under those rights, you need to provide the ARVs. Okay, so that would be the difference between, that would be the way in which an NGO would uphold a certain norm of, well, prevention. If you can prevent it, we won't need to cure you. So it's throwing it back at you and saying, well, you didn't prevent it. So now the fact that you are HIV positive is your fault. And there were social movements who were working to undo that sort of norm, to change the way that people understood this HIV and how the struggle for ARVs were relevant. Okay, but we're going to talk much more of that going forward. So civil society is the site of hegemony and a way the ideological structure of the ruling class is organized to preserve and develop its theoretical front, its ideological front. This is because civil society is a sphere of developing cultures. It's concerned with the manners and mores of society. It's concerned with the way people live. It's the place really where values and meanings are established. So the state is the outer ditch. Civil society represents the fortresses, from that quote. But it's also from the sphere of civil society that a revolutionary strategy could emerge. And Gramsci called this the war of position. So it is within civil society that the coercive apparatus of the state could be dismantled, gaining access to political power, giving rise to a society where no individual or group is reduced to subaltern status. So for those of you not familiar with this term subaltern, it's basically a reference to people who are outside of the hegemonic power circles. So think of people who are marginalized, people who are voiceless, okay? So for Gramsci, revolutionary activity, as opposed to inciting rebellion, would take the form of dismantling and instilling an alternative forma mentis. So that's Latin for shape of the mind. This would be done by means of cultural preparation, intellectual development, and education, and it would be done in the sphere of civil society. So here, let's take that example again of social movements that would build counter-hegemonic ideologies that would change perceptions. The TAC, for example, did a lot of work around, sticking with our example, did a lot of work around ARVs and the safety of ARVs, because, you know, one of the way that the state had dismissed making ARVs available in the public healthcare sector was by saying, well, you know, these medications are toxic. And yes, they do have high toxicity levels, but it was the TAC who did the work of unraveling those sort of misperceptions about ARVs being dangerous. You know, when I did my TAC research, because I did work around it at that time, and a lot of people I interviewed said that they would never take the ARVs because they thought they were poisonous. And it was quite interesting to understand how they had come to this understanding. You know, it was political parties, ANC, local branches that would be putting this view forward, and people had absorbed this view and left feeling that ARVs was not the answer for them. And the TAC had to do a lot of work around dismantling these views at community level. Okay, so, you know, the TAC in this sense was piercing the common sense of the day and, you know, instilling a good sense. It's obvious if you have a disease, you should have rights to medication for that disease. Of course, if you want to make the choice not to take the medication, that's also up to you, but it should be available to you in case you want it. And we're going to talk a lot more about the TAC and that this will become also much clearer in the coming sessions. Okay, so cultural preparation in the sphere of civil society, changing the forma mentis, altering the shape of the mind. So Gramsci compared the war of position, with the war of maneuver. So the war of maneuver is seizing state power before the groundwork of social organization has been completed. So a passive revolution results from the war of maneuver. A passive revolution is an abortive or incomplete transformation of society. You won't have a proper transformation of society if you've had war of maneuver, if you have a passive revolution. So you've heard that French saying, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And we've heard lots of critique in our own country, sort of more than 20 years after the transition. Things really are very much the same. All the promises that were made around the RDP have not come to fruition. Things have actually gotten a bit worse, and we're going to talk about South Africa in more detail going forward. So a passive revolution is an incomplete transformation in society. So there may have been a change of power or turnover of power, but nothing else really has changed. So in this situation, opposing forces are easily co-opted. And there is a situation of revolution and restoration. So restoration of the old ways, right? Nothing's really changed. So critical to the war of position are something that Gramsci referred to as, well, some people that Gramsci referred to as organic intellectuals. So organic intellectuals are critical agents in the raising of consciousness. You would have heard this term that's been used quite a lot in South Africa lately, woke. Are you woke? So the raising in consciousness, how conscious are you? So organic intellectuals for Gramsci clarify political thinking of social groups to understand their existing situation in society. And there are 3 levels of consciousness. The first is a cooperative level. So this does not challenge the status quo. It lobbies for interests of a particular group. The second level of consciousness is class consciousness. So this would be where there is the focus on the formation of a political authority that would serve the leading fundamental class. And then the third level of consciousness is hegemonic. Here, there would be an effort to make the new order the natural order of society. So you could have these levels of consciousness operating at various stages in a particular movement, for example, or if you look at an organic intellectual and what she or he is trying to do within a movement, could be operating at all of these levels or at one of these levels. It could evolve, it may not necessarily be linear. There may be outside events that cause a change in these levels of consciousness. Okay, so the notion of civil society is an idea that has evolved over time. The idea has, from the classical, if we look at Aristotle's time, Aristotle understood civil society as participation, right? The polis, the political order. The idea was that civic virtue was where people were active and acted in the best interests of their community. Through the modern and Enlightenment thinkers like Hobbes and Locke, Kant and Ferguson, civil society was seen as a way to restrain absolute power. More recently, theorists, 20th century theorists such as Habermas and Putnam, and I'm sure that you would have come across their work in some of your other courses, understood civil society as social capital. So Robert Putnam, for example, looking at social networks, social trust and norms of reciprocity, He was, arguing that if citizens are very active in associational life, as a strong civic community, then your democracy is functioning well. Habermas concerned himself with civil society spaces, what he calls third places. So casual everyday meeting places like coffee shops and laundrettes. For him, these constitute political society where matters are discussed and debated, where public opinion is generated. I suppose social media is one of these platforms as well. So this notion of civil society regained popularity in the 1990s. And this is because of the resistance to various socialist regimes that were located in civil society. So I'm talking about things, for example, the falling of the Berlin Wall. All of those struggles were in the civil society sphere. Transitions to democracy also saw civil society playing a significant role. And this paved the way for a role envisaged for civil society in democratic consolidation. So civil society was important in leading up to transitions, so resistance to authoritarian regimes, but then also important after the transition in building or consolidating democracies. Civil society also became a key term for development processes to promote participation, to promote good governance. So the civil society space has been through a long process of evolution along two broad strands of thinking: concerns with the moral compass of citizenship, concerns with the conditions of participation. And civil society is no longer confined to the borders of the territorial state, though. It's linked with concepts of power of the powerless, a way that citizens are empowered, a way that citizens can regain control of their lives. There's also been an increase in the emergence of horizontal, transnational, global networks and interconnectivity. So we've seen this, for example, with the struggles against globalization. We've seen it very recently with Black Lives Matter, where there was transnational networks, across Europe, who also marched for racial justice. So civil society is seen as a way to limit the extension of state power, also to address a lack of response by the state. And I think that I'm going to leave it there. I just want to share these two cartoons with you, just to give you something to think about in the sessions going forward. So the first one, I'll give you a minute or so just to look at it. So the question here you could ask is, who does civil society represent? Okay, we don't have to answer these questions now, but think about that as we move through the sessions. Who does civil society represent? If you have a movement for racial justice, is it made up of people who've suffered racial injustice? Is it funded? Who is it funded by? What are some of its goals and tactics? Okay, and then the second one, well, you don't need a minute to look at that. I suppose the question here that I want you to think about is, how much power really does civil society have? And what happens when it's easily co-opted? What value then can we draw from civil society in times when it's co-opted? Okay, I'm going to leave it there.